Hey, it's MJ from the coaches panel. I hope you're well. Nah, it's not the 50 most relevant. Don't worry, that's still going. It's our first strategy episode of the preseason. Joining me on this episode to help unpack a bunch of different narratives and nuances as we look specifically at the format of AFL Fantasy. There's some great wisdom that both our guests today want to share with you. But don't panic. If you're a dream teamer or a super coach, you're like, I'll just log out of this episode. I'm done. Don't do that. I'll tell you why. One, there are some parallels across the way you play the game that is going to come through. So that while this is curated for AFL Fantasy, with the 40 trades that you've now got, there might be some learnings that you can take. And sometimes it's just a little idea that can spark another idea and help you along the way. Joining me on this episode, as he has ever since the inception of the coaches panel, it's fellow co-founder Rids. Mate, it's nice to see you. We've been planning and talking about this episode for a couple of weeks. It's exciting to finally get it out there into the fantasy footy community.
Was that tongue-in-cheek, MJ? Nice to see me when I'm AI Rids on the screen right now?
Well, it's a nice statement. To be fair, the AI Rids is a better looking version of Rids.
Yeah,
so.
plus I can hide when I'm doing the finger at the camera at you and everything else. Like, I can hide behind AI Rids.
I think that's fair enough too. Also on this episode, you've heard him on a number of episodes of the 50 most relevant, and he's jumping in for this strategy conversation. Vams, nice to see you again, mate. And again, can't see you. It's an AI version of you too.
Good to be here, gents. Can't wait to get stuck into it.
So let me set the groundwork for what this episode is all about. Both Vams, Rids, I suppose you could throw me in the mix of that too. We've played the game of AFL Fantasy for a really long time. And in 2023, both Vams and Rids set out to play AFL Fantasy with one objective in mind. Draw as many lessons as you can, make as many mistakes as possible, glean as much as you can from what the community does do and how the unique nuances of the game function, with the strict intent of being able to share them with you on this episode, and then for them to apply them heading into the 2024 season. And so what I've asked both these guys to do is to give me 3 big key takeaway and learnings to share that with us, and we'll unpack that as a trio as we work through this episode. So maybe Vams, we'll start with you. Give us your first big takeaway and lesson, and we'll have an opportunity to chat about it off the back.
Yeah, good on you, mate. Look, Rids and I, it's interesting. Like you said, Rids and I have a lot of parallels in terms of our, let's just say, our fantasy careers. And last year, just coincidentally, we found ourselves in the same keeper league a year or two ago, and we actually got chatting sort of outside the league. Outside the league. And started talking about sort of AF in a little bit more detail in terms of like how to actually play the game. Because again, not speaking on his behalf, but I probably didn't appreciate some of the nuances in terms of how to put a team together, how to sort of build through the season such that you're going to be in the best position to win a hat. And look, you're probably doing me a bit of a service there in terms of saying that I set out with one goal in mind, and that was to learn that. That's not quite true. I make no mistake. I set out to win a hat. But unfortunately didn't get there. But the side effect of really taking it seriously last year was that I was able to come away with some learnings, which I'm hopeful able to go into this year with. And so I guess the first thing I want to talk about as my first learning from last year was just this idea of don't assume that last year is going to repeat into this year. I talked about this in a little bit of detail on our 50 most relevant with LDU, and in particular wanted to focus on the midfield. And I see a lot of people really strive towards wanting to put not necessarily a lot of these uber premium midfielders into their starting team, but certainly wanting to try and put at least one and perhaps even 2 of these midfielders that are around that 110 average mark into their midfield, with the sort of under the premise of, look, I want a bit of safety, or I want a good captain option and this sort of thing. And when you look back at it, it's actually, the idea of doing that is actually built on a relatively false premise. Again, the premise being that you think it's safe and that, I'm going to put a a Bontempelli in my team. Yes, he's expensive, but at least I know I'm going to get. And again, history shows that that's actually not necessarily the case. And in fact, I'd go one further and say it's actually quite rarely the case. Just some data here, and we've let's just say abused Jaden's generosity with his time a fair bit already this preseason. But once again, at very short notice, he came back to me when I put a question to him with regards to how many. The question I put to him was how many midfielders, fantasy midfielders, who averaged 110 or more in season one, let's call it, or last season. How many of them went on to average at least 108 plus? Or let me rephrase. How many midfielders that averaged at least 110 plus averaged within 2 points per game to the downside of their prior average? I.e., if someone averaged 110 last year, how many of them did they, or let me rephrase again. If someone averaged 110 last year, how many went on to average at least 108 the following year? Or if someone averaged 114 last year, how many then averaged 112 or more the following year? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely it does.
So here's what he said. So from 2012 onwards, there were 80 non-rucks that averaged at least 110. And only 11 out of those 80 didn't regress with at least that 2 point per game buffer. Yeah.
Wow.
And so again, so what that says, roughly speaking, only about 1 in 8 mids that average 110 will go on to do roughly at least what they did the previous season. So again, coming back to that point of I want to go and pay for 110 point per game mid because I know what I'm getting and I've got a safe captain option and it's worth spending up to have that safety. Again, roughly 1 in 8 mids priced around that mark is going to do roughly what they did last year at the very least, let's just say. And so not only are you not potentially, getting what you pay for, you're going to be losing. Like, these guys tend to lose a lot of cash potentially. Like, the alarming thing when you look at the list of these guys is that, yes, you do have some that roughly stay around about what they did the previous year. And yes, you do have the very occasional, this very small handful, perhaps only 3 or 4 players that really made a big bump. Rory Laird from 2021 to 2022 being probably the most recent example. But the vast majority of them drop a lot. And so I guess what I would say as my first learning is be very, very, very careful about selecting these roughly 110 point per game price midfielders, because again, not many of them will repeat last year's performance the following year. And again, the key is also in those let's call it first 5 to 10 rounds. So many of these midfielders that build these very, very large averages, let's call it 110 plus, they often do that on the back of very, very high tackle numbers. And whilst I've yet to be able to sort of confirm this with statistics, when you eyeball it and go back and manually look at some of these midfielders, again, their tackle numbers in, let's call it the first half of the season to the second half of the season, they're drastically different. So there is some potential reason as to why you do get that sort of early drop-off. But it's not always the case. You can pick examples of players that, that do start off on fire. Clary Oliver last year being a very, very good example there. And so, look, I think as me and Rids both go through our learnings, just keep in mind, these are our sort of guidelines, let's call them, but they are guidelines. They're not formal rules. If you find someone that's, averaged 108, 109 last year, and you reckon, and you've got some logic as to why you think they can go to another level for whatever reason, go for it. So again, these are guidelines. So that would be my first point that I'd probably want to put out there.
Some really nice stuff to pick up. Rids, before I get yours, anything you want to extract further from that or unpack in a different area that Vams has shared with us just then?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really want to point out here, it's very easy for the young fellas, the new age coach, to not have that learnings from a few years ago. It's hard for us, yeah? We were brought up with the Ablets, the Swans, the Rockcliffs, who not only went 110 back to back to back, they went 120, 130 back to back. So that's where that thought process comes. It's like, hey, we got a captain option that we can actually rely on and we can bank on. And often what it means is if you've got that captain pumping out those massive scores early on, you're actually really doing damage on people who don't have those captains, okay, at that point. So I just wanted to just mention that point, because now we're talking about a much lower, it's like 110 price tag at the moment for those midfielders. So the reality of the situation is we just don't have a Swan or an Ablett or a Rockcliffe, maybe a Tom Mitchell a couple of years ago when he went 120. But guess what? If you don't start with those guys, it's not going to take your season away, as Selby proved a few years ago when he didn't start with Tom Mitchell, okay?
Yeah.
So it's still not going to be the be-all and end-all, but it makes it a lot difficult if you get off to that flying start. That's all.
Yeah, I'm curious, Vams. We'll get Rid's first one in a second. How much do you think the evolution of the rolling lockout and the ability to vice captain and captain different players every single week, has that also become a unique factor in this component or thought process for you as well? Because again, Rid's highlights a generation that grew up playing AFL fantasy. Any further back than 2020, rolling lockouts weren't really a thing in AF. So is this also another nuance that helps further build this narrative of, no, you don't have to bank in this 110 guy?
Yeah, I think certainly that plays a part. I think the main thing though is just the limited trades. I mean, this concept of picking an 85 point per game guy with the hope that he might go on to average 100, and then at his buy you'd use a trade to then flip him to the 110 guy. That really wasn't much of a thing. Like you had 20 trades. You might want to keep 3, 4, 5 trades for for those inevitable last 3, 4 rounds when you had restings. And don't forget, the reason why the AFL brought that extra that week between the last round and the finals was because they did that because so many teams were resting players in that last round, and they wanted to stop people from doing that. So we would often leave a few of those trades for those last few rounds where you might cop some bullets from either injuries late, where your bench might be very thin. Obviously, those restings in the last round as well, and so you would really only perhaps have maybe 15 trades to upgrade your entire side from the start of from round one, and you add in some again inevitable injuries or maybe some longer suspensions that you might cop along the way. You might really only have perhaps even 10, 12 trades maybe to upgrade your entire side. So that's, perhaps like a quarter of what we've got now, perhaps not quite, but it's far less. So again, you can now again, back then the approach was start with as many end keepers as you possibly can, because you're not going to have as many trades as you might want to do sideways trading, let's call it. So you've got to start with as many keepers as you can and fill out the rest of your side with cheap guys. Now it's like quite the opposite. Now it's build up, and we'll get into this, but it's more about build up your team value as much as you can, because hey, you've got enough trades to bring in whoever you want. So make sure you've got enough cash to make those trades happen. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Rids, what's the first takeaway lesson you want to share from 2023 that's going to help coaches as they head into 2024?
Yeah, so one of the key ones for me, and I know there's many ways to do this, okay, but one of the key ones for me was dead rookies in the first 5 rounds. They need to be addressed. Now, my definition of dead rookie is those rookies, yeah, they might be playing, but they're not going to generate enough cash to really build that base for your team. Like Vams just said a second ago, yeah? It's really important early days to build that team base, because you want to really capitalize when you get into that second and third scores of the 5 price like rolling average, that it's heavily weighted and you're actually making good money for as many of your squad as you can, because you really do need to build that base If you don't do that, it really becomes very difficult, especially later in the season, to chase down teams that have got a points advantage, because they're able to build up and then to grab the best of any line. So that's going to start at the rookies and work their way up. And Vam said it a minute ago, yeah? It also works from premiums and coming down as well, because if you're losing it from the top end and you're making it well from the bottom end, you've got to have that balance, because it's still going to be that base that you're building across the board.
Yeah, it's really good. Vams, any reflections off the back of that learning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it just, I think certainly in the last couple of years, again, I've noticed is it pays to spend up for the rooks that you have more confidence that they're going to play. Their scoring potential is going to be better. It's so tempting, man. Like, we're all putting our starting teams together now, and it's so tempting. It's like, oh, I want to move this M4. I want to upgrade them a little bit. You know what? I'm going to, instead of putting that 250K rookie on my bench, I'm going to find someone that's 200K, and I can make my starting team, just that little bit better. And, it's very easy to fall into that trap of optimizing for your starting team. But boy, if you pick that 200K rookie because it allows you to improve your starting team just that little bit, but come round 2, if they're dropped or they spit out a score of 12 or some garbage like that, you'll be regretting that decision. And so again, just focusing, just like Rid said, focusing on doing everything you can to make sure that you've got that bench cash gen going. A term that I think Rids coined last year, bench hygiene.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important, because those dead rooks, if you think about your cash or your team as almost like this, blood vessels, blood flowing through, your team generating cash. A dead rook is like a blood clot, you know what I mean? And it just blocks everything up. And it's really important that's addressed, like Rid said.
It's really good. Rids, I'm curious, this might steal one of your other boys' thoughts as we head through this episode, but it feels like it's a nice point to ask. So, Rids, when you in those early rounds of end of round 1, 2, 3, wherever it is, and you have this quote unquote dead rook, but you also have, let's use the term maybe loosely, a premium or a mid-price guy, and you're not happy with what both are giving you, what should be the priority at that point in time? Is it address the dead cow and deal with that other challenging moment? Or is there ever an element where the mid-pricer or the premium not working out for you is more of the priority?
So what happens here, okay, is it relates to what Vam said a minute ago. You don't go out and you pay top dollar for a premium, okay, because there's chances he's going to regress, which means he's going to leak cash at a much, much better, bigger rate, faster rate than what would be the case if he went in and spent 15,000, 20,000 left at the price point, because there's a little bit less risk in that. It's actually risky to go out, and people are going to like headbutt the wall and everything else, but listen to me, okay? It's actually riskier to go and pay 110 price tag for a guy who averaged 110 last year, because one bad score or anything else means you're gonna have to move off that to salvage that, like those dollars, okay? So that's why I think at the end of the day, last year, Vams and I were in this keeper league. We were just chatting, people were interested in doing some salary cap for the year. People sort of knew who I was. There was a bit of a discussion, and we started just talking, okay? And one of the things that we noticed last year in the pre-season was the term value. Now, I never could get my head around, what does the term value mean? Why are people so focused on the term value? And I think a lot of people were using it wrongly in the way that they were applying the thought process, and they didn't actually quite understand what it meant. So this is what they're regarding, okay? Like, you look for a player with value, so that way you're mitigating your risk involved in making that spend, because otherwise, if they go out and get points scored, doesn't match that points you're spending, it's really dead money that's been spent at the most crucial time of the year. So that's why if you have a dead rook and you have someone at 110 that you've paid for that's averaging 60 last year after round one, and I'm thinking of Rory Laird, okay?
Sure.
They're both as high priority as each other. You need to, but it's the cash that you're losing that's the highest priority. So you've got to trade out of a Laird at the highest point. And we grew up, yeah? You got to back your rookies. You got to back your rookies. Be safe. Be hard. I've said it many times. You back him in, you know, because that's the old school mentality. And often we hear Selby saying it, you know, old school mentality, new school mentality. That's what it means. It's because we're so used in trying to conserve trades and trying to have that keeper mentality from round one. We want to have 12, 13, 14, maybe even 15 keepers from round one, which means we're going to conserve trades to get to a 22 keeper team, completed team. That's the mentality that needs to change, because we got trades every week now. We can actually, from day one, from round one to round 22, you can have a totally different team. Okay, so you just got to change that thought process. There's a few things we say at the wrong points in times. And this is the nuance that I think Vams and I picked up very quickly. And that's true bad. Like, I mean, last year I started Rory Laird and I was like, oh, okay, let's have a look at this. And I had many opportunities trade out of Rory Laird. I think I even said in pods, no, I'm not going to trade out of him. Why am I trading out of him? People would message us, and we remember MJ last preseason. What am I going to do with Laird? What am I going to do with Laird? Well, my advice last year would have been, oh, you probably hold on to him and you stick fat. Guess what my advice is this year? Get off him. Go, run, find someone else, you know. Go to your Setterfields. Yeah, because that's what you really want.
Let me just ask you a question. I just want to ask you a question on that one, Rids, because I think certainly with, let's call it, you know, dead rooks or misfiring mid prices, I think everyone would agree with that. So just to sort of push back on that point, let's just say you pick an uber premium. So let's just say this year, let's call him Andy Brayshaw. Perhaps you know, seems to be a relatively popular guy priced at about 110. If he comes out round one and gives let's call a 50 is probably an extreme example, but you might say, look, it's only relevant
75.
in that example.
Let's pick a nice
if he comes out
but round
75, if you are of the view that, look, that was just you know, no change in his role. I don't see anything in that game that makes me think that he can't potentially continue to average 110 from here.
Yes.
Do you still think that he should be traded out purely to, you know, to stop that bleeding cash, at least in the short term? Or would you say, look, I still think he's going to average 110 from here. Yes, he's going to come down in price now. And yes, there are a few people that are going to pick him up 50, 60, 70K cheaper in a few rounds' time. Or do you say, look, okay, I've lost that cash already, essentially, but I still think he's going to be a good scorer from here. What do you think about that?
Yes, so to answer that, I'm going to be really weird, okay? For a start, I won't be starting an Andy Brayshaw this year, so I won't have that scenario because it's an awkward scenario to face. Because no matter what you decide, it could go either way. It's really one of those toss the coin out. So I'm just not going to put myself in that situation by not even starting a 110 guy this year in the midfield. So that's the first part, okay? The second part is no matter what you do, you got to back your eye, but what else do you have in your team? What other bullets do you have along the journey? We saw last year, okay? And I'm going to use Matty Mottram, okay, as an example last year. Everyone whinges and complains about bullets along the way. Matty Mottram started last year with, what's his face, Cherry? And then he also started with Josh Kelly, who went and got concussed and missed the round two pretty much.
So two forced trades after the first round.
2 forced trades after round one.
Yeah.
He turned that into Setterfield, and then he turned Cherry into English.
Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes the worst luck could present the best opportunity for you to then. But again, he saw something in English that went, you know what? English right now is value at this point in time. There's some value add there. Yes, he was priced at 110. But if you think English and you've seen something with English that you think he's going at 120, that's when you jump on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the delicate balance. So, but I'm just trying to highlight here, don't put yourself in that nasty 50-50 call, because then you're relying on luck to sway either way.
I think the other element that, don't want to glaze over what Rids just said 5-10 minutes earlier about what's the priority for you in those moments, addressing the dead cows. And so sometimes you might get backed into the position where using that 75 of an Andy Brayshaw, it's like, okay, he goes 75, but you miss the equivalent of a Cade Chandler, and you're stuck with a teammate where you pick the other guy that gets 40. It's like, nah, I've got to get that, and I need to do it. That's where the beautiful nuance of AFL fantasy and fantasy footy in general is. It's really hard to give hard and fast, always across the board advice, because every team, while there are a lot of similarities, and I want to unpack that with you boys throughout this episode too, there are nuances that come across the game as well. Vams, what's lesson number 2 that you took away from 2023 playing AFL fantasy that's going to help coaches playing it in 2024?
Well, funnily enough, my second one is actually very similar to Rids' first one, which is no coincidence. Which again, given that we talked a lot about this last year privately, but again, just to sort of extend on Rids' point, my second one is more about, again, those early trades, and really it's going to seem obvious in terms of saying use those to fix up your starting team, but I'll go sort of one step further and say the key thing with those trades is, obviously everyone's going to have bullets that they're going to have to deal with, etc. But you really have to focus on picking up those obvious value guys that you've missed. Last year, early, at least after round 1, it was Setterfield, right? And perhaps even after, if not round 1, certainly round 2 or 3, it was probably Zeeble, right? The key thing there is that when you do have some, bullets that you have to deal with, Rids just mentioned Matty Mottram with Cherry and Kelly. And this is perhaps the difference. Whereas I had those same bullets as well, but I got caught in the trap of trying to bring in a keeper using those 2 trades. So I traded out Cherry and Josh Kelly, and I brought in Andy Brayshaw and Finn Callahan, who I thought at the time was value, and probably wasn't as much as I'd hoped anyway. And so often when you're forced with trades like that, it's very easy. Again, you've got a shiny uber premium mid sitting there. You can afford them. Again, my midfield is going to look great, and forcing yourself just to hold the reins a little bit, and instead go and find the guy that, look, to put it plainly, has the lowest break even. That it doesn't get much more complicated than that, right? It's just we've got this beautiful metric that tells us what how much value someone is at the moment, and it's based on their break even. Now, that's obviously based on what they've already scored and their current price, and value is probably more about what you think they're going to do. But the good thing after round 1 is, like, they've still got price rises still to come. So yes, you've missed that score, but don't worry about the score. And again, just to highlight Rids' point earlier, in those first 2-3 rounds, you've almost got to ignore your ranking and ignore the scores you're putting up. And your sole KPI should be about making as much cash as you possibly can. And by extension, the scores will come. Don't worry about that. But if you switch your mindset from, I need to try and maximize points, which often then leads you to try and bring in the uber premiums, perhaps prematurely. If you switch your mindset from that to, I need to make as much cash as I can in these first 5, 6, 7 rounds before, so-called upgrade season, then perhaps you're more likely to make those right trades. Now, It doesn't mean you can't bring a premium in, by the way. Rids just mentioned, again, Mottram. Last year, he brought in Tim English. Someone priced at 100 or priced at 105, it can still be value, but they've just obviously got to score higher than what they're priced at. So if you think, after seeing Clary Oliver for the first 2 rounds last year, this guy looks a different player. He's spreading. He's getting a little bit more outside ball than he was before. He's still only priced at 108, 109, because again, don't forget, in those early rounds, you got that magic number working against a player's average, so to speak. So if you think, look, this guy's potentially going to go 115 this year, go for it. So again, this is not about saying don't bring in a premium. It's saying, which guy can I bring in that's either, again, going to give me the most cash, or if you do want to bring in a premium, again, rather than going to someone who's priced at 110, he just scored 108 on the weekend. Even if he keeps going at 110, they're still going to drop cash. I think you're better off going and finding value. So that would be my second point. Again, just those first few rounds, change your KPI from maximizing scores to maximizing cash gen. And I think if you do that, it will reap benefits in, again, round 6, 7, 8. And you start making those upgrades, you'll be in a far more powerful position to move your team forward.
It's really good. Rids, you want to get in on the end of that before you share your second lesson from 2023?
No, I think Vams has explained that absolutely perfect. There's no me adding anything to that. It would be like
going around the mountain. We'll give us your second lesson from 2023 that coaches can apply to 2024.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of focus off the dollars, and I'm going to go to ownership focus, radio. And this was really hard because, there's a specific saying that I don't know. I think Vams and I might have ended up jointly forming this. Pretty much, there's a difference between DT and AF. Okay, I've had a little bit of luck with DT across the years.
Won a format there, sure.
Yeah, but with DT, it really rewards about being unique and to have patience. AF actually is the absolute. It punishes you. Like, if you're unique and you get it wrong
at the start,
or if you show patience, and if you don't, when you shouldn't show patience, AF absolutely smacks you across the face, radio, because you've done so. So really, it's more preferable to fail together than to be right alone when it comes to AF. Okay, because we all want to be the one, don't we? We all want to own the guy that breaks out. We all want to have that unique ownership. We all want to own that guy that's sub 5% ownership. Guess what, though? That's not going to win you a car at the end of the day. That's not going to win you a hat at the end of the day. All it means is that everyone else is jumping on a week or two later, and that unique ownership disappears. It just evaporates. And groupthink is real. I know that people think that I'm just bang on about it, but it is real, because if I've noticed this trend of this guy doing really, really well, hey, the way the world works right now with social media, with groups, with chats, with everything else, if I've noticed, I guarantee you 150 other people, and 100 of them are what are they called? Content creators right now?
Yeah.
I guarantee you it's getting yelled at in pods. Do this, do that. We've got AI repeating someone yelling to do this and do that, this person, that person. It actually is real, MJ. It's very real. And suddenly what happens is all this hype gets built up on that name. Everyone trades into them. There goes your uniqueness, radio.
Yeah. So, Vams, let's bring this into 2024. I want to get your thoughts piggybacking off the back of that, because I think people can hear what you've both shared on a couple of things and then feel an unintended collision of ideas, where one is about not starting these guys at the top end, that you don't feel there's a narrative of upside in scoring. And then Rids is talking about, don't get stuck in the unique world on the 2 or 3% that it pops for you, and the large variable of it either not going for you or everybody being there within a fortnight. What does that mean entering into 2024 for a player like a Nick Dacos, who, from an ownership perspective in AFL fantasy right now, is still amongst one of the most owned defenders and might not have as much quote unquote value as people might be thinking. So when these two worlds collide of, I don't know if there's value, but the ownership is so high, can you help us reconcile those two together to help us navigate that? And Dacos might not be the guy, but using him as an illustration, how do we reconcile these two things when it feels like they collide?
Yeah, I think we can try using Nick Dacos as an example. And
Sure.
you're right. He's got, I think I looked at it today, it was about 50% ownership. And this is a guy who he has a relatively early buy. He's got one of the early buys. He also runs into, I think it's if Finn, the Finn
McGuinness
tag
just before it.
Just before the buy. And then, potentially has a Will Drew tag waiting for him just as he comes out the buy. And again, he's priced at 110. Now, it's hard because, again, he's the sort of guy as well. And we saw it last year. I think he averaged 122 from his first 6 or something like that. So we know he can go at an absurdly high average over a fair chunk. So he's a hard one to fade. But what I would say, it was different last year. I feel like, first of all, there's a couple of things with his ownership. First of all, I would question, to put it plainly, what is the type of coach that's probably starting with him? And from what I've seen on Twitter and on podcasts, etc., a lot of the sharper fantasy coaches, none of them are, from what I can tell, not many of them are starting him. Now, does that mean they're right? Not necessarily.
Sure.
But I think Nick Dacos he seems to be he's like the golden boy of the AFL right now at the moment, right? So he's like, I question the rationale for why 50% of the comp is starting with him is I guess is my point. And so
Sure.
I would be happy to fade if I think that they're plainly wrong. You know what I mean? In terms of at least the logic. Again, I'm not saying he can't go at much higher than what he's currently priced at over 4 or 5 weeks. But when you add that extra buy into the round, I struggle to see a scenario where he justifies an early selection when you take into account that early buy. Without the early buy, I think it would be a very different discussion. And so I'm just not sure that people are factoring that in just yet, not to mention some of those matchups as well. And so I'm happy fading that. But Rids is right. We do have to at least take into account some of these ownership percentages. And the difference with Dacos last year was, one, he was priced, obviously much lower than what he is now. And two, there was a very, very good narrative as to why he could potentially completely pop as he did. The reason why many people didn't start that was because we were worried about all sorts of tags. Coincidentally, I'm now saying the same thing, aren't I? So clearly I haven't learned many lessons from 2023 after all, but there you go. So again, I think, Rid said, I think he said something last year, and maybe I'll ask him to repeat it. He'll probably explain it better than I can. But I remember him saying something about, look, if there's high ownership, but also the upside was there, it was something to do with that, where he had this almost like this heuristic at what point he would really take ownership into account and when he's not so happy to take ownership into account. So again, perhaps I'll pass that over to him to explain it a little bit better than what I could. But I guess I don't know. I'm probably not the type to focus or really build my side based around what others are doing, if that makes sense. But that's probably on me. Sense. I think that's the right prop. That's probably me. That's my approach. I'm trying to think of an example of a player. The player that I think would probably, for me, be a similar sort of situation would be someone like Jack McRae. He's someone that I'm a little bit, for this year, sorry. He's someone that I'm a little, if he comes in and has 40% ownership or 50% ownership, I probably will be afraid of fading that. One, because I think even in his, apparent current role, we saw over the middle course of, part of last year that he can still potentially score very well even without, bulk CBAs, etc., and can do it at for a decent stretch of games as well. And from memory, I think the Western Bulldogs have a reasonably, fantasy-friendly start to the season as well. And so you've got a guy that, again, can score potentially very well, with a large chunk of the comp potentially starting him. Wouldn't be that happy fading that. And you add into the fact that there's not that many great alternatives. So you ask yourself, okay, what if he does pop and the guy that I choose instead is a flop? Then you're in trouble. So for me, Jack Macrae is probably that guy that
About a contrast.
Compared to Dacos last year, that whose ownership I probably will be watching.
Yeah, so he's currently sitting at 42% at time of recording.
Yeah.
So he's right in that spot that you've talked about as well. Rids, any thoughts on that before we hand over to Vams for his final lesson from 2023 heading to 24?
Yeah. So what I sort of did was, and I think it was more around what I've provided in some of the feedback, because Vams and I were sharing feedback continually last year, okay? So I set up a couple of rules for myself. So one of them was any premium that's owned by 30% or more that I can see who represents 10 points of value, okay? That's who I'm interested in, right here. Any mid-price, 30% or more, that represents like 20 points of value. And I've just put some tangible elements to what I'm trying to set up. Just, again, sometimes I'm going to go against my own rule, because the Dacos is a perfect example. Dacos potentially does have 10 points of value in it.
Sure.
I don't see it. I don't think so. But due to what we've just said, his price point's at 110 this year. He's got a buy early days. He's got a couple of interesting matchups. I'll say interesting matchups. I don't see a world that Finn McGuinness is going to be not sent to him. Put it that way, especially after what happened last year.
Agree.
Okay, when he did go to him. So I just don't see a world that doesn't eventuate. I don't see a world that Willem Drew. But what I haven't forecasted there is, what have the Pies done to address that? Do they send Dacos forward? Do they send him into the midfield and then have more team players? There is a world that won't affect him. Okay, even if that's eventuate, the Willem Drews, the Finn McGuinnesses, Dacos is a unicorn. He's just a gun, right here. He's second year, MJ. He's averaging 110. What are we really, really going to put a limit on where he can go? He could be the next Ablett, yeah? I only just talked about it a minute ago. He could be the next Uber captain. Like, he could go 110, and this year, would it surprise you if we were discussing him winning a Brownlow this year going at 120 per se?
Of course not. No, of course not.
No, because we're all aware that that's a viable and a possibility in his development. It's only his third year, mate.
Yeah.
So there's no way known I'm going to come out and say it's definitely not going to happen. I think there's enough elements to it that means that I don't want to bank on it and pay 110 and bank that 110 is the right decision at that point. That's all.
So, Vams, for your final lesson learned, again, these are things that you went through and experienced in 2023 that now, as you apply those lessons in 2024 for you and for others, you believe are going to be really, really helpful guides navigating these final, 40 odd days before lockout kicks off.
Yeah, just before I get to perhaps my final point, just one final point on what Rich just said as well, which is taking ownership into account doesn't mean that you can't pick the odd, point of difference in your team, right? I think when you do that, though, it's important to question, what are you seeing that the rest of the entire fantasy community is not seeing, right? And there are guys like that, right? Like last year, Jaden Hunt, I had him in my side, and he was a great pick, right? So it doesn't mean that just because no one else, just because their ownership is very low, it doesn't necessarily mean you're missing something. But you've just got to be careful about, look, how many of these guys are you going to have in your team? If they fail, who are you going to transition to, right? And so just having some sort of plan around that, but again, also asking, all right, his ownership's very low. I think there's 25 points of upside here, but why does no one believe this? Why am I the only one, sort of saying this? And there's a really great book called The Wisdom of Crowds. I forget the author, where it's basically a book that the premise of the book is that sort of, large amounts of information by sort of communities or information groups, etc., generally results in better decisions than what might be made by an individual. So it's quite a pertinent point to this discussion here in terms of picking pods versus high ownership guys. But but again, coming back to what Rid said earlier, which is the you've got to ask yourself with regards to what's the risk versus the reward of picking a player like that. Because if you pick a low ownership guy, they happen to pop in the first round or two, everyone's going to jump on them. And, yes, you've got them a little bit cheaper. Yes, you've perhaps saved a trade and having to bring them in. But, I'd argue the risk is probably, outweighs the reward for the most part. But it doesn't mean you can't have some fun and pick the odd pod here and there.
Nice.
So I guess just for my final point, that also perhaps it does relate to sort of mid prices. And my final point is to suggest have a very, very high threshold for what you expect a mid pricer to be able to justify starting them. And I say this as someone that started a few mid prices last year, Dom Sheed being one of them. And again, so I'm hearing, a little bit lately this pre-season with regards to, look, what sort of points of upside should you be after to justify a starting pick? And the number you tend to hear a lot about at the moment is about 20. So if someone's priced at 60, 65, you want them to go at around that 85 mark to justify picking them. And that wouldn't make them a bad pick by any stretch. But what I would encourage people to do is, if you've got a mid-pricer, ask yourself, do they potentially have 30 points of upside in them? It doesn't mean they need to get 30 points of upside to be a good pick. But what you're really asking yourself when you ask yourself that question is, what is their upside? Or put another way, do they have a ceiling score in them? Because these mid-prices, what you're really wanting them to do is make bulk cash and make it relatively quickly. The problem when you pick someone, let's just say priced at 60, the problem is that, let's just say they go on to average 78, let's call it that. That inevitably has a couple of 72s in there, maybe a 69, then maybe a 78, and then maybe an 81. They're not really doing anything for you. They're not really adding some nice ceiling scores for you, and they're really not making cash quickly for you. So, and that was Dom Sheed early last year. He came, I think he was priced around that 60-ish mark from memory. I can't remember exactly. And he came out, his first 3 games were 79, 72, and 72, and then he got hurt. And so he started around about that 590K mark and got to only about 607K before he got hurt. And so, again, 3 games in, he's given you scores that are barely better than many of the rookie scores. And he's only, he's barely even made you 20K. So he hasn't really served any purpose there. And so I think by asking yourself and, really having a very high standard for what you want a mid-pricer to be able to potentially do, it perhaps doesn't, it stops you from putting in a player just because you are, in inverted commas, you think they're going to improve. No, be a bit more specific and ask yourself, does this player, over the first 6 rounds, can I see a world where this guy priced at 60 goes at 90 plus? That doesn't mean he has to average 90 for the entire season. Super key point, right? And so, a good example of a player like that this year might be someone like George Wardlaw that a lot of people are considering at the moment. I think he's priced, what's he priced at, about 65? Ask yourself, can I see a world where over the first 7 or 8 rounds, this guy goes at 90, 95 perhaps even, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do I think it's going to happen? No, but could I see it? Man, this guy is talented. He's built like a brick, you know what? And Yeah, I could see it happening. Like I can see him having a game where he comes out and puts up a 112, and all of a sudden his cash gens away. And so again, just putting yourself in a position to ask that question. Whereas, Carl Amon, is priced at about 87. Again, can you see a world where he's going to go at 100, 105 for the first whatever rounds? Again, asking that, not, they're priced at 78 and I think they're going to average, 90. No, I think just having a higher sort of expectation will potentially reduce the risk of you putting in a mid-pricer that, again, doesn't really do anything for your team, doesn't put up those good scores, and doesn't make you the big cash that you need. And the extension to this point is when you see one of those mid-prices early that is not doing it for you, jump off them real quick. And again, the example I would use last year was Andy McGrath. He went into the last season priced at 81. He was a very popular pick last year. I think there must have been some training reports and he must have done well in a couple of preseason games. I can't remember exactly what got the hype going, but something did. And again, became a very popular pick. And then he started the season going 81, 88, 79, 65, again. So he's not really outscoring his average, and he's certainly not making you any money. So, some of the very switched on coaches, a perennial high finisher, DT Lemon being, a good example. He saw that opening game and he just jumped off immediately. You know what I mean? Now, it's always easy in hindsight because there are other players who perhaps start slow and then build, but using whether it's data or using your own acumen when you watch the games to go like, look, this is not what I was expecting to see, whether it's they're not getting enough cheap ball, they're not being used as an outlet, they're not getting the kick-ins, whatever it is. If you've got that mid-pricer and and that you don't think is going to really pop like you thought he was going to pop, then coming back to that first point that both that Rids mentioned, jump off them and jump onto the guy that you've seen that clearly is going to do that.
Yeah, some really good advice for us there. Rids, bring us home on this podcast, mate. Don't let me down. Give me some gold advice to get us through the end of this episode.
Just before I do that, I
Please.
just want to go and revisit what Vams just said, because I think this is really important, okay? Be aware what guys are priced at when you're going in. Yeah, and then see what, add 30 to what they're priced at. And you'll know yourself, okay? Trust your gut on this. I'm going to use a poor example because the price rise slightly different. But Caulfield, for instance, in the back lines, he's priced at 39 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really that much of a leap to think that he's going to average 69 with the right role? He's been in the systems for a while. He was a high draft pick. He's gone and got a fresh change. And you're not saying he's going to average 70 for the whole year. We're saying he's got the ability to average 70 for a period of time. Vams just absolutely nailed that point. Quick cash. And DT Lemon's one of the best ever at it, okay? He generates that cash quickly and he gets off. As soon as he sees an exit point, he's gone, rightio? He's out the other side. But let's look at Heath Chapman in comparison. Now, he's priced at 54. Now, if you add 30 to that, that's 84. It's a bit more of a stretch, yeah? Sure. Like, can he do it? 100% he can. Okay. But if you aim for those guys that have that ability and it's not as much of a stretch, and you back yourself to really see that happening, if Chapman's draw opens up and he has 4-5 game stretch where he plays at home, he's got the right role. But at the moment, there's a few question marks around this, okay? Is he going to be on a wing? Is he going to be at the half back? What's he going to do, from week to week? He's still valued. That's 100%. But it's a bit of a stretch to say 30, whereas that might make it easier for you to decide then. If you're deciding between Chapman and Caulfield for a spot in your back lines, that might make it easier to make that decision, okay? Yep. No, and I just want to highlight as well, I loved how Vams brought up Warlord before, because just listen out. I think I did some collaboration with Bales just recently. It'll be coming out in the next couple of days, I believe. And that will be a Wardlaw versus Dow head-to-head that he was doing with his things. And that's going to be a nice, interesting discussion. And we do touch on that sort of stuff. You want one last one?
Give us one last bit of gold, mate. Take us home.
I wanted to go really Rids-like and go out there a bit. Rightio. One of the things I noticed last year, and one of the things I did was I was lucky enough to jump on a Sicily, for instance, early on. I saw Jack Zeeble had massive runs through the year. So the comparison there is that younger rebounding teams will likely slow as the year goes on. I know Hawthorn was a little bit more like they went all right, okay, last year compared to where we were going to do. But the fact of the matter was they still had to hold that ball when there was damage periods or times through the year when they needed to slow down a little bit. We saw North Melbourne, the way that they stopped teams scoring was to hold the ball. Sheasel, Jay-Z, whether it was Hall, whether it was Bailey Scott rolling back, whoever it was, they had some crazy numbers through the year. But the younger teams do tend to do that in periods of time. So, and I thought that was really interesting that we could actually rely on some guys here. And yes, these are guns, okay, but it doesn't even need to flow into guns. Now, let's think of West Coast, for instance, okay? Maybe you're keen on a guy like a Witherden. Now, if West Coast have to slow the ball at times and stop the opposition from doing damage, a guy like Witherden might fill this void at some point in time, or it might be a Duggan going back into the back line, or whoever it is. It might be a guy like Brad Hoff, okay? If you like someone and you see that they're starting to hold the ball, to slow down the game style, to try and limit the damage on the opposition scoring against them, back it in, because these rebounding teams are going to have to do these sort of scenarios at points in time through the season.
Some good advice there. Vams, any initial parallels? Like West Coast is interesting, North Melbourne is interesting, Hawthorn is interesting. Are there any players that immediately come to you? I know Rids just gave us a couple of options that you go, oh, this is the kind of guy we could be looking at that we could bring into 2024 as you unpack and kind of rethread some of those thoughts that he just gave us?
Yeah, I mean, based off that, I mean, I'm already, very keen and watching the West Coast backline like a hawk at the moment. Witherden, I've heard some West Coast fans suggest that he may not be best 22. You hear others say, of course, he's best 22. So happy just to watch that for the moment. But I think he probably is best 22 and certainly if he was named. You look at some of the numbers without Hearn there, especially when Witherden's not having to play as a sort of a defensive tall. There's no reason why he can't potentially go on to average 95 plus. So, and that goes back to Rids's point. They get a lot of marks. He's going to get a lot of, kick-ins as well. So, he's someone I'm watching and his teammate Brady Hoff, if he's in the right role as well, I think he could be, potentially good value. North Melbourne, the guy that, everyone's watching very closely, obviously Zach Fisher, and the rookie there as well. If they've got roles in their back line, you saw what, Zeeble and Hall and obviously Sheasel did last year in that North Melbourne backline. Whether we get the same exact numbers, I think that's probably unlikely. But even if we get 10%, 20% less than that, it's still going to be fantastic value for some of these guys. So they're probably a couple of the teams that I'd be watching, based off what Rid said there.
Nice. You boys have been fantastic on us in this episode. You've given not just three big rocks each that we can kind of share. There's nuances and layers to every single one of them. And honestly, we could probably spend another hour or so unpacking other life lessons that from a fantasy footy perspective, we can take from previous seasons and throw them in. Maybe we'll do another one of these as we head into the season proper. Rids, as always, mate, an absolute pleasure talking to you about AFL fantasy and getting some of your wisdom to share with the community on this episode.
Not too easy. And just remember, guys and girls, whoever's listening out there, this is just guidelines. It's nothing's guaranteed, yeah? So, I mean, by all means, if you want to yell and abuse me on Twitter or anything else, if something doesn't come to fruition, do it anyway. Call me a goose, whatever. I don't really care anyway. So, yeah, it's a bit of fun. Let's have a bit of enjoyment, yeah?
Let's not go for the abuse thing. Let's not be a toxic community.
No,
But I hear your point,
MJ.
what you're saying.
I'm okay with it. I'm old. I don't really care anyway. I'll just retire from them. It's all good.
I'm not worried about them to you. I'm worried about you back to them if they poke the bear. Vams, as always, mate, a pleasure to be chatting fantasy footy with you. We've loved having you part of the coaches panel with a bunch of stuff this preseason. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of other conversations we have with you during the preseason and season proper to come.
Good on you, mate. Thanks for chatting.
If you want to check out any of the other podcasts we've been dropping right throughout the preseason, whether it be the 50 most relevant and some more preseason strategy episodes across all the formats, we'll be dropping them for you. Make sure you're following on wherever you get your podcast feeds. You can be able to check them out. There are articles dropping every single day, 50 most relevant related, sure, but a bunch of other strategy and team-based pieces of content are starting to roll through at coachespanel.tv. You can keep in touch with both Vams, Rids, and any of the other members of the coaches panel across X and other parts of social media. We've put their ability to get in touch with them on X specifically in the description of this episode. And we've also been offering video content in 2024. If you've been loving the episodes we've brought to you on YouTube, thank you so much. Make sure you're subscribed. If you've not watched one, go on over, check it out. We so appreciate your support there. And speaking of support, it's not too late to get involved in our Patreon supporter group. For a few dollars a month, you help the coaches panel power on in 2024. And there are great rewards and content bonuses that come your way. All the details to join our Patreon can be found in this description of the episode. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate you. More to come in the 50 most relevant right up until the middle portion of February. And then the preseason really ramps up as we hit a bunch of different match reviews and more strategy episodes from us to come. Thank you for tuning in, and we can't wait to talk more fantasy footy with you very, very soon.